There existed a truth so dangerous, so brutally honest, that it separated one man from millions of others across history, and even today, most men don't possess the discipline or courage to face it, let alone live by it. And that man was Miyamoto Musashi, a name whispered in the echoes of ancient Japan, a warrior who walked through life like an unmovable shadow of death, a man who fought in more than 60 duels where defeat meant instant execution, and yet he never once tasted loss, never once knelt to fear, and finally left this world at the age of 62 without ever being conquered. But what truly made Musashi legendary was not his blade, not his physical power, not even the rivers of blood that followed his path. It was his understanding of why men fail long before they ever step onto any battlefield. Because Musashi discovered that the downfall of most men had nothing to do with their enemies and everything to do with their own minds. And in the final years of his life, before departing this world forever, he wrote a brutally honest manuscript revealing the 3 addictions that quietly rot men's spirits and steal their power without them even realizing it. And when you understand what those 3 poisons are, you may begin to see your own reflection inside them. But before diving into those truths, pause for a moment, because if you are truly here to rise above the ordinary masses, then prove it by subscribing to this channel, by standing with those who seek strength instead of comfort, and activating the bell so these messages continue to reach you. And now, as we step into the real story, understand this. What you've heard about Musashi so far is only a thin surface scratched on a mountain of depth. Because Musashi was born in the year 1584, during one of the most violent, chaotic periods in Japanese history, where villages were burned, loyalty was purchased with blood, and life held no guarantee beyond the present moment. And by the age of 13, he had already taken his first life. Not in a ceremonial duel, not in an honorable contest, but in a raw and brutal clash that shaped his entire existence. And by 16, his name was already spreading through the lands as a ghost-like figure that could not be stopped. Yet what most people fail to comprehend is that Musashi was not merely a warrior carving his legend with a sword. He was a hunter of the human mind, a master observer of emotion, behavior, insecurity, and ego. And instead of simply training his body, he modeled his life around studying the inner landscape of the men he would one day face, memorizing how fear manifests in the eyes, how doubt reveals itself in posture, and how arrogance disguises weakness. And long before a duel ever began, Musashi had already defeated his opponent inside his own mind. Which is why modern scholars, including a respected historian from the University of Tokyo, have said that Musashi did not conquer because of speed or superior strength, but because he understood the mechanics of human nature on a level that most people will never reach in a lifetime. And it was through that understanding that he identified the 3 great weaknesses that erase a man's potential before it can ever be realized. And the first of these deadly chains is the addiction to approval, because Musashi realized something centuries before neuroscience confirmed it, that every time a man receives praise, validation, or approval from others, the brain releases a pleasurable chemical, a tiny reward that feels good. And like any drug, it begins harmlessly, but slowly turns into dependency, until a man no longer lives for his own purpose, but for the reactions of others, chasing likes, compliments, attention, admiration, approval from strangers and peers in a never-ending cycle. And Musashi warned that the moment you start needing others to confirm your worth, you are no longer in control of your own value, because your power has been handed away. And a man without internal power is nothing more than a hollow shadow, moving but not truly alive. And this weakness has only grown more destructive over time, as modern men measure themselves by views, comments, followers, and attention, losing themselves in a false world built on validation instead of volcanic inner strength. And the second weakness Musashi uncovered is the habit of escaping discomfort, because he observed that the average man is obsessed with avoiding anything painful, anything uncomfortable, anything that forces him to grow, whether that means avoiding difficult conversations, dodging responsibility, numbing himself with entertainment, food, substances, or distractions. And yet what Musashi knew from both battle and solitude is that true strength is forged only through discomfort, because the human mind grows only when pressed, only when challenged, only when forced to adapt. And modern neuroscience now confirms that new neural connections are formed when the brain is pushed out of its safe and familiar patterns, meaning that the very discomfort men run from is the gateway to evolution. And Musashi not only understood this, he hunted discomfort, intentionally placing himself in situations that would test his mind and body, walking into the unknown, embracing hardship as a teacher instead of an enemy. And because of this, while others remained mentally stagnant, he evolved into something beyond ordinary comprehension. And the third weakness he revealed may be the most devastating of all, which is slavery to uncontrolled desire. Because Musashi saw that most men live chained to their impulses, chasing pleasure, craving stimulation, obeying hunger, lust, laziness, anger, and emotional urges without resistance, assuming this is freedom, when in reality it is nothing more than servitude to the lower mind. And as long as a man cannot command his own desires, he is no better than an animal driven by instinct instead of reason. And Musashi chose a different path by removing attachment to excess, to indulgence, to immediate pleasure, training himself to respond consciously rather than react automatically. And in doing so, he became master of himself instead of slave to sensation. But his philosophy did not stop with these three poisons, because in his search for ultimate mastery, Musashi made a decision that most men would consider impossible. He chose total solitude, a life without emotional support, without romance, without close companionship, without comfort, isolating himself in forests, caves, mountains, choosing silence over noise, stillness over chaos, and loneliness over distraction, because he believed with unshakable certainty that a man discovers his true nature only when there is no one left to lean on. And in those long years of isolation, stripped of external identities and masks, he came face to face with what he called the three inner demons that live in every human mind. The first demon being doubt, that mocking voice that whispers you are not good enough, not capable, not worthy, and that tries to convince you to remain small and safe. The second demon being the belief in dependency, the craving for others to fill emotional voids, the fear of being alone, of being unwanted, of being forgotten. And the third demon being fear itself, the fear of failure, rejection, loss, pain, humiliation, and death. And as Musashi sat in stillness day after day, surrounded only by cold air and silent trees, he did not run from these demons. He stared directly into them, examining them, wearing them down until their voices lost meaning and their power evaporated. And it was during this dark and lonely period that he created one of the most extreme mental practices ever recorded, a ritual he performed every morning, where he would sit in silent meditation and vividly imagine his own violent death, visualizing his blood on the ground, his body torn apart, his final breath leaving his lungs, not in a morbid fantasy, but as an act of liberation. Because by accepting death fully in his mind, he eliminated its power. And when a man no longer fears death, he no longer fears anything life can throw at him, which is why Musashi walked through the world with a stillness so profound that it seemed supernatural. And psychologists today understand that the fear of death is the root of all human anxiety, and once that fear dissolves, the mind becomes free, fearless, untouchable. And after enduring this psychological crucible for years, when Musashi finally returned to society, he was no longer simply a man. He had become something else entirely. And those who faced him in duel described the experience as standing before a living abyss, where his eyes contained no hesitation, no anger, no emotion, only calm certainty. And many of his opponents knew they had already lost the moment they stepped into his presence, because his confidence was not arrogance, it was silence. It was absolute internal alignment. And during this time he formed 5 unbreakable laws, laws not written for ordinary men, but for those who seek absolute mastery. And the first was to embrace loneliness rather than fear it, because solitude reveals truth without distortion. The second was to transform discomfort into strength, because resistance builds power. The third was to destroy emotional dependence on validation, because needing love and approval weakens the soul. The fourth was to live as if already dead, removing fear from every decision.
And the fifth was to dominate every impulse instead of being dominated by them, creating total internal sovereignty. And it was this mental evolution that led to the greatest test of all, the duel against Sasaki Kojiro, a swordsman considered nearly equal in skill, where Musashi used not strength but psychology as his primary weapon, arriving hours late not by accident but by design, allowing his enemy's mind to fill with frustration, doubt, and anger, while he calmly carved a wooden weapon from a boat oar. And by the time the duel began, Kojiro was already broken internally, and within seconds Musashi defeated him, not just physically but psychologically, proving once again that true warfare takes place in the mind long before blades ever meet. After the duel with Sasaki Kojiro, a moment that history remembers as one of the most decisive confrontations ever recorded, something unprecedented occurred within Miyamoto Musashi, a silent shift that few could understand and even fewer could replicate, because instead of chasing more blood, more glory, more battles to reaffirm his dominance, he walked away from violence as if it were a closed chapter, leaving behind the need to prove himself to the world. And this is where the true transformation began. Because the strongest warriors in history were never the ones who could kill the most men, but the ones who reached a point where killing no longer controlled them. And Musashi reached that level of mastery where his power no longer depended on destruction, where victory no longer required an opponent. And this is the exact point where most men fail to follow, because they believe that masculine strength is found in domination, in being louder, bigger, more aggressive, more feared. But Musashi realized that true masculine dominance comes from self-mastery, from internal order, from an unshakable identity that does not bend with circumstance. And for the next 20 years of his life, he lived as a living contradiction of the warrior stereotype, spending his time not in violent conflict, but in creating, writing, painting, sculpting, contemplating, and teaching. And by doing so, he proved the biggest lie modern men are taught, which is that toughness must always look angry, violent, cold, and detached, when in reality, the most dangerous man in the world is the one who has nothing to prove and nothing left to fear. And this was when Musashi began to unveil what he called the hidden code of the truly strong, a silent language written not in words, but in behavior. And the first unspoken law was that truly strong men never announce their strength, because announcing power is a sign of insecurity, like a storm that needs to warn of its arrival, while true strength moves in silence, observed only through results. And that is why men who constantly seek recognition, who demand respect, who crave admiration, reveal by their desperation that they possess none of it internally. And the second code was patience, a level of patience so deep that time itself could not disturb it, because weak men rush. They rush decisions, relationships, success, revenge, validation, pleasure, but strong men can wait. They understand that timing is everything, and that the universe always exposes those who move too early. And Musashi waited in silence, waited in darkness, waited in obscurity, because he knew that the world always rewards those who can endure longer than others. And the third hidden code was mental flexibility, the ability to adapt, to change direction without ego, because the weak man is married to his opinions, terrified of being wrong, while the strong man discards false beliefs with ease, like removing an old skin. And that is why fragile egos cling to arguments, identities, and labels, while powerful minds remain fluid, evolving, always learning. And the fourth code was brutal honesty with oneself. Because strong men do not hide their weaknesses with lies the way fragile men do. They study their insecurities, their fears, their laziness, their unresolved anger, and they turn those flaws into battle plans for self-improvement, hunting their weaknesses the way predators hunt prey. And the fifth and final code was controlled unpredictability, because Musashi understood that patterns are cages, that predictability is the enemy of survival, and that the man who cannot be easily read cannot be easily defeated. Which is why he never allowed himself to become routine, to be labeled, to be easily placed in a box. And he lived his life in such a way that even those who observed him closely never fully understood him, leaving behind an aura of mystery and power that cannot be replicated through force alone. And then came what may be the most disturbing realization Musashi ever recorded, a realization about the true nature of male competition, something that explains why the majority of men will always remain average. And what he saw was that most men do not actually compete to win. They compete to avoid losing. They do not strive to dominate. They simply want to survive, to stay safe, to maintain comfort. And that difference, that tiny psychological distinction, is the line between predator and prey. Because predators move forward to conquer, while prey move backward to defend. Predators plan for victory, while prey plan for protection. Predators accept pain for growth, while prey seeks softness and stability. And Musashi chose to become the hunter, mentally, physically, spiritually. And he designed a mental exercise so brutally honest that almost no man would ever dare to attempt it, where he imagined losing everything that gives men identity: his reputation, his name, his money, his possessions, his status, his home, even his health. And then he asked himself a question that shattered all illusions. If all of this disappears, if the world forgets me, if I am left with nothing, am I still strong? And because he had built himself from the inside, not from the outside world, his answer was always yes. And that is where true power lives, not in what you own, not in who knows you, not in how people see you, but in what remains when everything else has been stripped away. And that is the final measurement of strength. And here is what most men will never understand. The difference between strong men and weak men is not defined by achievements, bank accounts, relationships, status, or success. It is defined by dependency, by what they cannot live without. Because a weak man is dependent on approval, on pleasure, on distraction, on validation, on attention, on entertainment, on relationships to fill the emptiness in his heart, while a strong man can exist in silence, in isolation, in emptiness, and still stand unshaken. And ironically, because of this independence, the world begins to chase him. Because when you stop needing the world begins to need you. When you stop craving approval, respect appears naturally in your presence. When you stop begging for attention, attention is given without effort. When you release attachment to success, success gravitates towards you like gravity. And this is the paradox Musashi discovered centuries ago. That true power arrives when the hunger for power dies. And now this knowledge rests in your hands at this very moment. And there are only two types of men who will reach this point in the story: those who feel threatened by it and those who feel awakened by it. And if you are still here listening, reading, absorbing, then you already belong to a rare percentage of men who feel the call of evolution, the silent invitation to rise beyond the weak, beyond the average, beyond the addicted, beyond the distracted. And now the choice is no longer Musashi's, it is yours. Because knowledge without action is just another form of self-deception. So you can close this and return to your old patterns, your old habits, your old excuses, your old fears, your comfortable weakness that smiles at you every day like an old friend. Or you can step onto the path of transformation, the same path walked by warriors, philosophers, kings, and conquerors, not of countries, but of themselves. And if you are truly ready to commit, not for a day, not for motivation, not for inspiration, but for a lifetime of discipline and internal mastery, then make a declaration that cannot be taken back. Write in the comments, "I accept Musashi's challenge," and let the world, and more importantly your own mind, know that you are no longer willing to live as the man you once were. And subscribe to this channel without hesitation, because what follows from this point are not stories for entertainment, they are blueprints for power, mental weapons for those who are courageous enough to use them. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: weak men seek comfort and approval. Strong men seek growth and isolation. Weak men run from silence. Strong men are built in silence. Weak men beg to be seen. Strong men command attention without asking. Weak men are ruled by impulse. Strong men rule over themselves. And the path that lies ahead is not easy. It is lonely. It is demanding. It is uncomfortable. But it is also the path to the highest version of yourself. And at the end of this road, you will not need validation. You will not need praise. You will not need permission. Because you will become what Musashi became: a complete man, unshaken, unbreakable, unbound by the world. And when that day comes, you won't need to tell anyone who you are.